Hello! In today's lecture, we will study triangle of exposure, white balance, color temperature, and three-point lighting. But first of all, we need to know what is a frame. A frame is a single still image in a sequence of images that then played in rapid succession, create the illusion of continuous motion. This concept of perceiving a series of still images as motion dates back to 1878, when Edward Muybridge captured a sequence of photographs of a galloping horse. This groundbreaking work laid the foundation for motion pictures. Nearly 2 decades later, Thomas Edison introduced the kinetoscope, a device that further evolved in the modern motion picture technology we use today. In a sense, a video is simply a sequence of many still photos played back quickly enough to trick the eye into seeing smooth movement. In the early days of cinema, most silent films were shot at around 16–18 frames per second. This slower frame rate is why the motion in these films, such as those featuring Charlie Chaplin, often appears sped up and comical. So it's not just maybe the actor was moving faster than in usual life. The frame rate of 16–18 frames per second helped to achieve this comical speedy effect. The standard frame rate for television and film today is 24 frames per second, which provides a smooth and natural viewing experience. As we move towards more immersive forms of storytelling, such as virtual reality, 360-degree videos, and augmented reality, frame rates become increasingly critical. When using VR headsets like the Vive or Oculus Rift, frame rates become a crucial factor in maintaining comfort and preventing motion sickness. At 30 frames per second, users may start to feel dizzy, and at 24 frames per second can experience nausea. To ensure a comfortable and immersive experience, VR systems require a minimum frame rate of 60 frames per second, with many developers aiming for even higher frame rates, ranging from 90 to 120 frames per second. The evolution of frame rates, driven by advances in technology and the demand for more immersive experiences, is pushing the boundaries of what we can achieve in visual storytelling. The next topic for today now is exposure. Exposure in cinematography refers to the amount of light that reaches the camera sensor, which determines how bright or dark the resulting image will appear. It's a critical factor that influences the visual quality of every shot, affecting not only the brightness but also the mood, tone, and detail captured in the scene. Proper exposure ensures that detail in both the highlights, bright areas, and shadows, dark areas, are clearly visible, contributing to the overall visual narrative of the film. Achieving the right exposure is about finding a balance between capturing enough light to reveal important details without overexposing or underexposing the scene. Overexposure occurs when too much light hits the sensor, causing part of the image to appear washed out or blown out, losing detail in the brightest areas. Underexposure, on the other hand, happens when too little light reaches the sensor, resulting in a dark image where details are lost in the shadows. In cinematography, exposure is not just about technical accuracy, it's also a creative tool that can be used to convey emotion, highlight certain elements, or guide the audience's attention. For instance, a well-exposed shot in a dramatic scene might maintain the detail in both the actor's face and the dimly lit background, enhancing the emotional impact. Exposure is controlled by adjusting three key camera settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Together, these make up what is known as triangle of exposure. Whether you are shooting in a controlled studio environment or outdoors in natural light, understanding this triangle is essential. In cinematography, this concept extends to how light is captured over time, influencing the mood and motion in video footage. By mastering the triangle of exposure, you can begin to push the boundaries of your creative expression, allowing you to adapt to different lighting situations with confidence. Today, we will explore each element of the triangle of exposure in detail and discuss how they work together to shape the final image. Aperture refers to the opening in a camera lens through which light passes before hitting the camera sensor or film. It's measured in f-stops, such as f2.8, f4, f8, and so on, with lower numbers representing a wider aperture and higher numbers representing a narrower aperture. The aperture setting controls the amount of light that enters the camera, directly affecting the exposure of your image. Beyond just light, the aperture also significantly impacts the depth of field in the photos. A wide aperture, low f-stop, creates a shallow depth of field, which means that the subject is in sharp focus while the background is blurred. This is often used in portrait photography. Conversely, a narrow aperture, high f-stop, increases the depth of field, bringing both the subject and background into focus. This is common in landscape photography. Adjusting the aperture allows you to control the creative aspect of your image, such as isolating a subject from its background or making the entire scene sharp. Understanding how to use aperture effectively allows you to make more informed decisions about how you want your image to look and feel. What is important to remember that the exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor, creating visual data over a period of time. Shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to the amount of time the camera shutter remains open to allow light to hit the sensor. It's measured in fractions of a second or even full seconds for long exposures. A fast shutter speed, such as 1/1000 of a second, freezes motion, making it ideal for capturing fast-moving subjects like sports or wildlife. On the other hand, a slow shutter speed, such as 1/30 out of second, allows more light to hit the sensor and can create motion blur, which is often used to convey movement in the image. So here are the 4 examples of pictures that were taken using different shutter speed. In low light situation, you may need to use a slower shutter speed to allow more light in, but this could also increase the risk of blur without stable support. Using extremely slow shutter speed produces long exposure shots, such as light trails or smooth water effects, but requires a tripod to avoid camera shake. Understanding shutter speed is essential for capturing both still images and motion in video, where the choices of shutter speed can dramatically influence the feel of the footage. But important to remember that shutter speed also affects the sharpness of the image. Even the slightest movement can cause blur if the shutter speed is too slow. Coming to the third element of the triangle of exposure after aperture shutter speed, this is a ISO. ISO measures the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light, originally referring to the sensitivity of film in film cameras. It is represented by numbers such as 100, 200, 400, 800, and so on, with lower numbers indicating lower sensitivity and higher numbers indicating higher sensitivity. The ISO setting allows you to brighten or darken your image without changing the aperture or shutter speed. A low ISO like 100 or 200 is ideal for shooting in bright conditions where there is plenty of light. A high ISO like 800 or 1600 is useful in low light conditions, but can introduce noise or grain into the image, reducing overall image quality. The amount of noise introduced by high ISO settings can vary depending on the camera, with newer models often handling higher ISOs better. ISO is a powerful tool for adjusting exposure, especially when you can't change the aperture or shutter speed due to creative constraints. However, it's important to use ISO carefully, as increasing it too much can lead to a loss of detail and decrease in image sharpness. In cinematography, understanding how your camera handles ISO at different levels can help you to make better choices in various lighting conditions. And here's the important information about native ISO. It's the ISO settings at which your camera sensor is designed to operate most efficiently, capturing the highest possible image quality with the least amount of noise. This settings provides the best dynamic range, meaning it can capture the widest range of light intensities from shadows to highlights. It also minimizes digital artifacts like noise and grain, which can become more prominent at higher ISO levels. For most cameras, the native ISO is typically around 100 or 200, depending on the model and sensor design. Whenever possible, shooting at or near the native ISO will help you capture the highest quality images with the least amount of digital noise. This part is dedicated to understanding the connection between elements of the exposure triangle. When you adjust one, you often need to compensate by adjusting one or both of the others to maintain proper exposure. For example, if you widen the aperture to let in more light, you may need to increase the shutter speed or lower the ISO to avoid overexposure. Similarly, if you slow down the shutter speed to capture more light in a dark scene, you may need to narrow the aperture or decrease the ISO to prevent the image from becoming too bright. Each setting has its own impact on the image appearance. Aperture affects depth of field. Shutter speed affects motion blur, and ISO affects noise level or grain level. Finding the right balance between these three settings is a matter of understanding both the technical and creative aspects of photography or cinematography. In challenging lighting conditions, you may need to prioritize one aspect, such as maintaining a fast shutter speed to avoid motion blur, and adjust the other settings accordingly. So understanding all of this connection inside this formula, triangle of exposure, allows you to make informed decisions about how to achieve your desired outcome. With practice, balancing the triangle of exposure, will become second nature, enabling you to quickly adapt to different shooting environments and achieve consistent, high-quality results. Let's look at how the triangle of exposure applied to real-world scenarios, starting with portrait photography. In portrait photography, you often want to isolate the subject from the background, which can be achieved by using a wide aperture such as f1.8 or f2.8. This wide aperture creates a shallow depth of field, making the subject stand out while the background is softly blurred, drawing attention to the person's face. To maintain proper exposure, you might pair this with a moderate shutter speed like 1 per 250 out of second and a low ISO around 100 or 200 in good lighting conditions. Now consider sports photography, where the goal is often to freeze fast-moving action. In this scenario, you would use a fast shutter speed, like 1 per 1000 out of second, or faster, to capture sharp, detailed images of athletes in motion. Since fast shutter speeds allows less light into the camera, you might need to widen the aperture or increase the ISO to compensate and maintain correct exposure. For night photography, the situation changes entirely here. A slow shutter speed is often required to gather enough light, sometimes for several seconds. A tripod becomes essential is to avoid camera shake, and you might use a narrow aperture like f8 or f11 to ensure that more of the scene is in focus. In this low light environment, a high ISO might be necessary, but you'll need to balance it carefully to avoid excessive noise in the final image. The triangle of exposure is foundational concept that unlocks a world of creative possibilities in both photography and cinematography. And by mastering aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you gain full control over how light is captured, allowing you to create images that are not only correctly exposed, but also artistically compelling. Pay attention to the recap questions because they will help reinforce your understanding of the key concept we've covered. Take the time to review and think critically about the material.